Good afternoon. It's with great pleasure that I stand here after 2 decades of studying bullying and trying to call attention to the issues of gender nonconforming and LGBTQ youth. So I'm very excited. This is a highlight of my career. And I want to thank you all for being here and also recognize the 30-some graduate students that have done this work and all of the superintendents and principals that allow us to come in and ask these questions to get some answers. So I'm going to, we have the stage is set very nicely to show that gender nonconforming and LGBT youth experience victimization and bullying, but I want to unpack this a little bit for you in the 12 minutes that I have. So certainly we do know from a number of colleagues, including my colleague of Joe Robinson at the University of Illinois, and former students like Paul Petit, who are continuing to do this work that is very, very challenging in the schools. We know that bullying occurs most frequently among LGBT youth in American schools in comparison to those who identify as straight or heterosexual. We also know from the great work from the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, GLSEN, that there's very high rates of victimization among LGBT youth, including physical assaults and others. And we continue to cite some of their work. It's very important. What I want to talk to you about, though, is as I'm out in the field and trying to do large randomized clinical trials to address the victimization among LGBT youth and gender nonconforming youth. As we were doing this work in the early 2000s, we started to hear language of homophobic name-calling and epithets in elementary school children and middle school children. And what we noticed when we looked to the bullying literature is that no one was addressing this. In one of our studies, we actually found that 35 to 50% of bullying in the middle schools we were surveying was homophobic in nature. And to our surprise, none of the bullying prevention programs were addressing this. Certainly GLSEN, Trevor Project, Clemente Foundation, all of them have these, and Gender Spectrum, have programs, and they're going into schools, but they're going into schools where the schools want them there. And so if in fact you don't have a progressive, open-minded principal, these things will not be addressed. And in fact, we heard the homophobic language on the part of teachers toward students as well, right? So we know that the large percentage of bullying among middle school students involves the use of homophobic teasing and slurs. And we know that because schools have allowed us to come in and ask kids about this language in large surveys and longitudinal studies. So this isn't a cross-sectional finding, that's an anomaly. It's in most schools, and it takes you about 5 minutes to hear one of these words when you enter a middle school in the United States, unless there's adults that stop that language or kids that intervene to say that they do not engage in that type of language. But the reality is, and we can go back to some of Nan Stein's work early on around sexual harassment and Michael Kimmel's work around this notion that our breeding grounds, our schools are really kind of breeding grounds for this type of victimization. The pervasiveness of anti-gay language in schools suggests that most school environments are hostile to LGBTQ students and create negative climates. But it's not just it's for all youth. This language bothers all children and many adults in the context of the schools. I want to unpack some longitudinal data that we have, again, been very fortunate to be funded by the Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Justice that have trusted that we were on to something, that in fact this was a real phenomenon that was happening in our schools. And what we find is that, again, homophobic name-calling is quite prevalent. Again, I'll say that 35 to 50% in some of our schools, the content of bullying is homophobic in nature, right? And are we addressing this? And so point directly to the need for prevention and intervention that targets this language. We also know through causal modeling, and I would have had a big structural equation model here with lots of circles that I was so proud of. But you can just imagine that, and you can certainly look at the fact sheets and read our publications. But we know that youth that engage in bullying in 5th and 6th grade go on, become more nuanced causally to engage in homophobic name-calling toward their peers. Largely within friendship groups, it's the homophobic bantering that we hear, but certainly it is directed toward kids that are gender nonconforming or identify as LGBT. So there's a causal link, and again, great work to show, but it doesn't stop there. This finding just clearly shows that if we're going to reduce bullying among middle school kids, we have to talk about this language and the powerful use of homophobic epithets to put kind of gender nonconforming and LGBT kids into a place in which we're kind of only promoting a heteronormative environment. Bullying prevention programs, and I can say this over and over again, should include a discussion of this language. Unfortunately, if you're developing a bullying prevention program that you want to market to all the schools in the United States of America, any type of risky behaviors like talking about homophobic language or sexual harassment gets taken out, and we have to rely on GLSEN and Trevor Project and other kind of nonprofits to help us with this. But again, we have to have some type of policy, clear enumerated laws that say we have to address this language. Otherwise, schools will opt out, as they have in even basic surveys about this language. But let's take it a step further. Again, longitudinal analysis. So we have kids that engage in high rates of bullying. They go on to engage in homophobic language. And when you create a heteronormative environment, if you deviate from that, what happens? If, in fact, I'm a target of homophobic language and I need to demonstrate that, in fact, I'm heterosexual, even if I don't really know what I am, then I'll engage in sexual harassment toward other peers. So we then find, in a 5.5-year study, that the connection between bullying, homophobic language, then transitions into sexual harassment, and in high school, it turns into teen dating violence perpetration. And so the connection is very, very strong with homophobic language. In the middle school, it affects all of the youth and all of the adults in the building, and it contributes to a negative climate. And certainly we need to think about, we do have legislation that says that we should be talking to kids about sexual harassment. Large part of sexual harassment in middle school is not sexual assault, it's actually unwanted sexual commentary and homophobic language and sexual rumor spreading. And so we should definitely continue to do this type of work, but our longitudinal study is one of the only ones out there to really track this with the younger kids. I want to move on now to, it's not just these individuals, but to think about the peer context. As researchers, we understand that human behavior and human development unfolds in a complicated layer in which we're influenced by, yes, certainly our families, but also the peer group. We've had several papers that have come out, really strong social network papers, to say that a lot of this homophobic language and sexual harassment is grounded within the peer group. And so a former graduate student of mine, Michelle Burkett and Paul Petit, and I have published to say that we must think about how it is that we're going to shift this language, the sexual harassment, at the peer level. How do we shift the norm such that peers intervene alongside the adults to say that that is not a type of climate that we want to create? Only one bullying prevention program of the hundreds that are available actually attempt to target or shift peer norms or even mentions LGBTQ bullying. This is a major, major problem. Part of the issue is that our federal government was supporting a program for bullying prevention that we thought was proven, that came from Norway. And I'll speak a little bit more about the fact that we have really kind of ignored this idea of developing prevention programs with American children. So moving on through the ecology, we also need to not only think about individuals and the ways in which our attitudes and our prejudices and our bias contribute to what kids experience in school, and certainly the peer group, which is very, very powerful in middle school. But also let's move to the school climate level. And again, these are complex multi-level analysis that you can read in a number of our publications. But what we found in this large-scale study, this is 36 middle schools, 4,000 kids, and we surveyed 1,500 staff, and we did some complex multi-level analysis and found some very simple, not surprising findings, but very powerful because the kids reported separately from the teachers. So multi-informant, multi-level, 2 states, Illinois and Kansas. When middle school staff, teachers, cafeteria workers, bus drivers report that they have an aggression problem in their schools, the kids tell us separately, we will not intervene to help anyone that's being victimized in the school. Okay, so this clearly addresses that if you have an aggression problem, this bystander intervention kind of craze that we have going on, empower the bystander, is not going to work unless you get your aggression problem under control. More exciting, perhaps, though, is that when the staff and teachers say, yes, we are addressing bullying, yes, we do have youth involved on committees, yes, we do involve parents, the kids bully less, they are victimized less, and they fight less. Again, paying attention to the fact that the kids are watching what we're doing in schools, and if we're attempting to do something, it appears to pay off. Even more exciting, when the teachers and staff agree that there's gender equity and they do not tolerate sexual harassment, right? Just basic, do not tolerate it. The kids report that they engage in less homophobic name-calling. They're less likely to be victimized through homophobic name-calling. They engage in less sexual harassment, perpetration, and victimization. So if we simply just complied with Title IX and train our teachers around sexual harassment and sexual harassment policies, we would see a change in this behavior. So clearly, prevention intervention programs need to address the school climate through teacher trainings and school climate improvement efforts. If it were up to me, bullying prevention would be substituted with school climate improvement process, because I think we need to target all levels of the ecology. I would be remiss if I didn't talk to you a little bit about how we're doing as far as preventing bullying, because I think if we're having a challenging time preventing regular kind of garden variety bullying that doesn't involve bias or gender or harassment or sexual harassment, we're going to have a hard time moving the needle on this more complex phenomenon. And so if we looked at the Campbell collaboration, Tofty and Farrington's largest meta-analysis that was conducted in 2011, I'll give you just a short synopsis. In order to reduce victimization in schools, we need to have non-punitive disciplinary methods. We need to involve parents. Use of videos, teaching teachers to do cooperative group work with kids, and it appears from this meta-analysis programs that were effective in reducing victimization needed to be longer and intense. One thing I do want to note for many of you that may be writing up bullying bills, peer mediation is contraindicated. We had said that in 2003. It's good to know that a meta-analysis in 2011 supported that finding. Putting kids, if in fact it's a real bullying situation, putting the perpetrator and a victim in a room to mediate, it actually makes the victimization worse. What about bullying perpetration? As you'll see, this list is quite long in the bully perpetration, in that to reduce perpetration, we need to have parent training meetings, improved playground supervision, non-punitive disciplinary methods, classroom management, classroom rules, teacher training, whole school anti-bullying policy, cooperative group work, and a lot of these elements over time. So if any of you are like me that works with schools, can you imagine going in and asking for all of that, right? When in fact, if I could just get them to do a 50-minute social emotional learning lesson, I would be a happy researcher. We do know from this meta-analysis, though, and I want you to listen to this very carefully, these programs and the reductions they found of 10 to 30%, this did not happen in the United States and Canada. When you think about these proven programs, they're programs outside of the United States. We need to develop or evaluate programs that have been developed with American children, as opposed to that are really complex, right? I mean, I live in the state of Illinois. Chicago looks very different than downstate Illinois, and context matters, right? And so we need to think about rural, urban, and suburban contexts. In addition, none of these studies or programs evaluated addressed homophobic name-calling or assessed even LGBTQ. So we need to do more work to see how these programs need to be expanded to address gender-based harassment. One thing that I'm going to leave you with, I have just 2 more slides, I'm almost there, is to think about social-emotional learning as one mechanism. We do know from the Durlac meta-analysis that if you're in a school with SEL programming, your academic achievement is much higher than if you're in a school without SEL programming. And we have been successful in our middle school trials of Second Step, developed by a Committee for Children for Social-Emotional Learning, and have found that over time, when implemented with fidelity, we have reduced homophobic name-calling, sexual harassment, and bullying, especially if there's real strong fidelity. So some additional recommendations, and again, I encourage you to read the chapter in the book that includes a lot more recommendations. We do have evidence from Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network that a presence of effective GSA does create safer spaces for kids who identify as LGBT, as well as their heterosexual peers. Teachers of all educational levels should be educated. We are in the throes of talking to teachers just basically about what LGBT stands for, and that's kind of where we're at with a lot of the teachers in the school, so we have to start basic. But we also just really need to do more research to develop and evaluate these teacher training programs and identify the barriers to doing this work to create safe spaces for all youth in our schools. Thank you.